gave me an enormous office with a private refrigerator, 2 secretaries, and complete charge of a staff of 75 writers, exploiters, and radio men. I was enormously impressed. I went straight out and bought a new suit. I tried to speak with dignity. I set up filing systems, made decisions with authority, and ate quick lunches. I was convinced that the whole public relations policy of Warner Brothers had descended upon my shoulders. I perceived that the lives, both private and public, of such renowned persons as Betty Davis, Olivia de Havilland, James Cagney, Edward G. Robinson, Errol Flynn, Humphrey Bogart, Ann Sheridan, Alexis Smith, and Alan Hale were entirely in my hands. In less than a month, I became aware that I had stomach ulcers, probably cancer. My chief war activity at the time was as chairman of the War Activities Committee of the Screen Publicist Guild. I liked to do this work, liked to meet my friends at guild meetings, but these gatherings became matters of dread. After every meeting I was violently ill. Often I had to stop my car on the way home, pulling myself together before I could drive on. There seemed to be so much to do, so little time in which to do it. It was all vital, and I was woefully inadequate. I'm being perfectly truthful. This was the most painful illness of my entire life. There was always a tight fist in my vitals. I lost weight, I could not sleep, the pain was constant. So I went to see a renowned expert in internal medicine. An advertising man recommended him. He said this physician had many clients who were advertising men. This physician spoke only briefly, just enough for me to tell him where I hurt and what I did for a living. He seemed more interested in my job than in my ailments, but I was soon reassured. For 2 weeks daily, he gave me every known test. I was probed, explored, x-rayed, and fluoroscoped. Finally, I was instructed to call on him and hear the verdict. "Mr. Shipp," he said, leaning back, "we've been through these exhaustive tests. They were absolutely necessary, although I knew, of course, after my first examination that you did not have stomach ulcers. But I knew, because you're the kind of man you are, and because you do the kind of work you do, that you would not believe me unless I showed you. Let me show you." So he showed me the charts and the x-rays and explained them. He showed me I had no ulcers. "Now," said the doctor, "this cost you a good deal of money, but it is worth it to you. Here is the prescription. Don't worry." Now, he stopped me as I started to expostulate. "Now, I realize you can't follow the prescription immediately, so I'll give you a crutch. Here are some pills. They contain belladonna. Take as many as you like. When you use these up, come back and I'll give you more. They won't hurt you, but they will always relax you. But remember, you don't need them. All you have to do is quit worrying. If you do start worrying again, you'll have to come back here and I'll charge you a heavy fee again. Now, how about it?" I wish I could report the lesson took effect that day and that I quit worrying immediately. I didn't. I took the pills for several weeks. Whenever I felt a worry coming on, they worked. I felt better at once. But I felt silly taking these pills. I'm a big man physically. I'm almost as tall as Abe Lincoln was and weigh almost 200 pounds. Yet here I was taking little white pills to relax myself. When my friends asked me why I was taking pills, I was ashamed to tell the truth. Gradually, I began to laugh at myself. I said, "See here, Cameron Shipp, you're acting like a fool. You are taking yourself and your little activities much, much too seriously. Betty Davis and James Cagney and Edward G. Robinson were world-famous before you started to handle their publicity, and if you dropped dead tonight, Warner Brothers and their stars would manage to get along without you. Look at Eisenhower, General Marshall, MacArthur, Jimmy Doolittle, Admiral King. They're all running the war without taking pills. And yet you can't serve as chairman of the War Activities Committee of the Screen Publicist Guild without taking little white pills to keep your stomach from twisting and turning like a Kansas whirlwind." I began to take pride in getting along without the pills. A little while later I threw the pills down the drain and got home each night in time to take a little nap before dinner, and gradually began to lead a normal life. I have never been back to see that physician. But I owe him much, much more than what seemed like a stiff fee at the time. He taught me to laugh at myself. But I think the really skillful thing he did was to refrain from laughing at me, and to refrain from telling me I had nothing to worry about. He took me seriously. He saved my face. He gave me an out in a small box. But he knew then, as well as I know now, that the cure wasn't in those silly little pills. The cure was in a change in my mental attitude. The moral of this story is that many a man who is now taking pills would do better to read Part 7 and relax. I learned to stop worrying by watching my wife wash dishes, by Reverend William Wood. A few years ago, I was suffering intensely from pains in my stomach. I would awaken 2 or 3 times each night, unable to sleep because of these terrific pains. I had watched my father die from cancer of the stomach, and I feared that I too had a stomach cancer, or at least stomach ulcers. So I went to a clinic for an examination. A renowned stomach specialist examined me with a fluoroscope. He gave me medicine to make me sleep and assured me I had no stomach ulcers or cancer. My pains, he said, were caused by emotional strains. Since I'm a minister, one of his first questions was, "Do you have an old crank on your church board?" He told me what I already knew. I was trying to do too much. In addition to my preaching every Sunday and carrying the burdens of the various activities of the church, I was also chairman of the Red Cross, president of Kiwanis. I also conducted 2 or 3 funerals each week, and a number of other activities. I was working under constant pressure. I could never relax. I was always tense, hurried, and high-strung. I got to the point where I worried about everything. I was living in a constant dither. I was in such pain that I gladly acted on the doctor's advice. I took Monday off each week and began eliminating various responsibilities and activities. One day, while cleaning out my desk, I got an idea that proved to be immensely helpful. I was looking over an accumulation of old notes on sermons and other memos on matters that were now past and gone. I crumpled them up one by one and tossed them into a wastebasket. Suddenly I stopped and I said to myself, "Bill, why don't you do the same thing with your worries that you're doing with these notes? Why don't you crumple up your worries about yesterday's problems and toss them into the wastebasket?" That one idea gave me immediate inspiration, gave me the feeling of a weight being lifted from my shoulders. From that day to this, I have made it a rule to throw into the wastebasket all the problems that I can no longer do anything about. Then one day, while wiping the dishes as my wife washed them, I got another idea. My wife was singing as she washed the dishes, and I said to myself, "Look, Bill, how happy your wife is. We've been married 18 years, and she's been washing dishes all that time. Suppose when we got married, she had looked ahead and seen all the dishes she would have to wash during those 18 years that stretched ahead. That pile of dirty dishes would be bigger than a barn. The very thought of it would have appalled any woman." And then I said to myself, the reason my wife doesn't mind washing the dishes is because she washes only one day's dishes at a time. I saw what my problem was. I was trying to wash today's dishes and yesterday's dishes and dishes that weren't even dirty yet. I saw how foolish I was acting. I was standing in the pulpit Sunday mornings telling other people how to live, yet I myself was leading a tense, worried, hurried existence. I felt ashamed of myself. Worries don't bother me any more. No more stomach pains, no more insomnia. I now crumple up yesterday's anxieties and toss them into the wastebasket, and I have ceased trying to wash tomorrow's dirty dishes today. Do you remember a statement quoted earlier in this book? The load of tomorrow, added to that of yesterday, carried today, makes the strongest falter. Why even try it? I Found the Answer by Del Hughes. In 1943, I landed in a veterans hospital in Albuquerque, New Mexico, with 3 broken ribs and a punctured lung. This happened during a practice marine amphibious landing off the Hawaiian Islands. I was getting ready to jump off the barge onto the beach when a big breaker swept in, lifted the barge, and threw me off balance and smashed me on the sands. I fell with such force that one of my ribs punctured my right lung. After spending 3 months in the hospital, I got the biggest shock of my life. The doctors told me that I showed absolutely no improvement. After some serious thinking, I figured that worry was preventing me from getting well. I'd been used to a very active life, and during these 3 months I'd been flat on my back 24 hours a day with nothing to do but think. The more I thought, the more I worried. Worried about whether I would ever be able to take my place in the world. Worried about whether I would remain a cripple the rest of my life, and about whether I would ever be able to get married and live a normal life. I urged my doctor to move me up to the next ward, which was called the Country Club, because the patients were allowed to do almost anything they cared to do. In this Country Club ward, I became interested in contract bridge. I spent 6 weeks learning the game, playing bridge with the other fellows, and reading Culbertson's books on bridge. After 6 weeks, I was playing nearly every evening for the rest of my stay in the hospital. I also became interested in painting with oils, and studied this art under an instructor every afternoon from 3 to 5. Some of my paintings were so good you could almost tell what they were. I also tried my hand at soap and wood carving, and read a number of books on the subject and found it fascinating. I kept myself so busy that I had no time to worry about my physical condition. I even found time to read books on psychology given to me by the Red Cross. At the end of 3 months, the entire medical staff came to me and congratulated me on making an amazing improvement. Those are the sweetest words I had ever heard since the day I was born. I wanted to shout with joy. The point I'm trying to make is this. When I had nothing to do but lie on the flat of my back and worry about my future, I made no improvement whatever. I was poisoning my body with worry. Even the broken ribs wouldn't heal, but as soon as I got my mind off myself, by playing contract bridge, painting oil pictures, and carving wood, the doctors declared I made an amazing improvement. I'm now leading a normal, healthy life, and my lungs are as good as yours. Now remember what George Bernard Shaw said, "The secret of being miserable is to have the leisure to bother about whether you're happy or not." Keep active. Keep busy. Time Solves a Lot of Things, by Louis T. Montant, Jr. Worry caused me to lose 10 years of my life. Those 10 years should have been the most fruitful and richest years of any young man's life, the years from 18 to 28. I realize now that losing those years was no one's fault but my own. I worried about everything. My job, my health, my family, my feelings of inferiority. I was so frightened that I used to cross the street to avoid meeting people I knew. When I met a friend on the street, I would often pretend not to notice him, because I was afraid of being snubbed. I was so afraid of meeting strangers, so terrified in their presence, that in one space of 2 weeks I lost out on 3 different jobs simply because I didn't have the courage to tell those 3 prospective employers what I knew I could do. Then one day 8 years ago, I conquered worry in one afternoon and have rarely worried since then. That afternoon, I was in the office of a man who had far more troubles than I had ever faced, yet he was one of the most cheerful men I had ever known. He'd made a fortune in 1929 and then lost every cent. He made another fortune in 1933 and lost that, and another fortune in 1939 and lost that too. He had gone through bankruptcy and had been hounded by enemies and creditors. Troubles that would have broken some men and driven them to suicide rolled off him like water off a duck's back. As I sat in his office that day 8 years ago, I envied him and wished that God had made me like him. As we were talking, he tossed a letter to me that he'd received that morning and said, "Read that." It was an angry letter, raising several embarrassing questions. If I'd received such a letter, it would have sent me into a tailspin. I